What if the moment you thought was the end was actually the turning point God had planned all along? Maybe life didn't go the way you imagined. Maybe you're sitting in silence, waiting for a sign, wondering if it's too late to start over. But what if, right now, He's whispering, it doesn't have to end this way. This isn't just a story. It might be the confirmation your heart has been waiting for. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear could change how you see everything. What if the chapter you're convinced is the end is actually the opening line to something greater? You're sitting alone in your car. The rain has been falling for hours, like heaven itself is grieving something you can't quite name. The engine is off. You haven't moved in what feels like years. You're holding your breath, not from fear, but because breathing might break you. You scroll through your thoughts the way you scroll through old messages, silently, frantically, praying something good is hidden inside. But nothing is. Just echoes, just endings. And then, in that silence thick enough to choke, something stirs. Not a noise, not a voice, not even a full sentence, just a whisper. It doesn't have to end this way. You blink. Was that you? Your mind making up things again? But no, that whisper didn't come from within your panic. It came from deeper, older, wiser. It came from the place inside you that still believes, still aches for something true, something holy, something that makes all this pain make sense. That whisper is not just a thought, it's an interruption, a crack in the hopeless narrative that's been looping like a broken record in your soul. It is God, speaking before the storm breaks you completely. And He isn't shouting, He never needs to. His whisper is enough to unmake despair, because the truth is, most of us aren't destroyed by one massive blow. We're undone by erosion, 1,000 tiny moments of disappointment that pile up like snow until something collapses. We reach our own conclusions. I'm done. This is too much. There's nothing left to fix. We assume silence from heaven means abandonment. We interpret the absence of miracles as rejection. But the whisper tells a different story. It's the first clue that what you believed was a funeral might actually be a rebirth. This whisper is for you, right here, right now, because the storm didn't start today. It began when life stopped aligning with your expectations, when a relationship cracked, when a job slipped through your fingers, when your health changed, when you prayed for something and got silence instead, when your confidence was quietly dismantled by invisible disappointments. You kept going, kept smiling, kept trying, but something inside you began to fray. And here you are, the edge. But God shows up differently than we expect. He doesn't burst through with fanfare. He begins with a whisper because His truth is not meant to compete with the noise of this world. It's meant to calm it. His whisper doesn't beg for attention. It invites transformation. And if you listen closely, you'll hear what you thought was the end isn't even close to the finale. It's merely the point in the story where the plot shifts. But that shift begins not with a rescue, but a question. What if your heartbreak wasn't a sign of divine absence, but the preparation for something only broken hearts can recognize? The whisper is God saying, I see the mess you think you've become, and I'm still here, I'm still writing. But we resist this idea because we've built lives on the assumption that what's broken can't be useful. We throw away shattered things, we abandon bent dreams, we hide bruises, and yet throughout Scripture God does the opposite. He doesn't avoid broken people. He builds legacies from them. Moses was a fugitive with a speech problem. Ruth was a foreign widow with no status. David was a forgotten shepherd boy. Mary was an unwed teenage girl. Paul was a persecutor of the faith. All of them were interrupted by God's whisper before their story turned. This pattern is no accident, it's divine strategy. You may not see it now, but the moment that feels most like an ending might be the exact setting required for something holy to emerge. Because God doesn't show up to preserve our expectations. He comes to resurrect what we thought was beyond saving. And that resurrection often begins before anything changes on the outside. It starts when your spirit flinches toward hope again. It starts with that whisper that says, "Not yet." This isn't how your story ends. You may be surrounded by circumstances that look like closure: divorce papers, eviction notices, pink slips, test results, unreturned calls. But heaven hasn't signed off on your ending. God's signature always rewrites the final paragraph. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most of us don't want to hope again because hope is dangerous. Hope means exposure. Hope means risking another disappointment. Hope means admitting we still care. But the whisper dares us. Try again. Believe again. Ask again. So what happens when you respond? You don't suddenly wake up with every answer. You don't hear angels or see skies split open. What you get is breath, a sense of quiet strength where there was none. And that, my friend, is how God rebuilds you from the inside out, because He isn't interested in making your life look okay to others. He's committed to restoring the very architecture of your soul. He doesn't need things to be pretty to begin His work. He's the God of ashes turned beauty, of dry bones rising, of tombs emptying, of dead ends becoming doorways. The whisper is proof. He's already near, already moving, already working on your behalf in this ways you cannot see. And yet you're not passive in this transformation. The whisper is an invitation, not a command. It asks for a response. It asks you to pause the mental spiral and lean in. It asks you to consider, what if the pain I'm feeling is not the end of my story, but the beginning of something sacred? It asks you to trade your fear of disappointment for a faith that says, even now, even here, something good can come. This is not wishful thinking. This is war, spiritual war, the battle over your belief that God still shows up, that He still rescues, that your story can still carry beauty even if the script has been torn. So what does it look like to accept the whisper? It looks like waking up tomorrow and daring to ask, God, if this isn't the end, then show me the next step. It looks like standing in your kitchen, tears drying, and whispering, I'm willing. It looks like opening a journal and writing a new prayer, even if your hands shake. It looks like telling a trusted friend, I think something new is starting, even if I don't understand it yet. The whisper doesn't erase grief, but it gives it a purpose. It doesn't cancel hardship, but it plants hope inside it. And that is where the miracle begins. Not in avoiding pain, but in discovering that God has already woven resurrection into the fabric of your story. So if you've been sitting in silence, wondering if heaven has forgotten you, listen again. That ache, that whisper, that slight stirring that things could be different, it's not your imagination, it's your invitation to live, to trust, to begin again, because God says it doesn't have to end this way. Which part of your life feels most like it's ending? A relationship or friendship that feels broken beyond repair. B, a dream or goal that feels too far gone to reach. Comment your answer below with A or B, and tell us why if you feel led. You never know who might need to read your words today. The storm that had raged the night before had finally stilled. Lena sat quietly on the porch of her late grandfather's old farmhouse just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Her fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, not because she was thirsty, but because holding something felt like proof she was still here. That whisper from the car, "It doesn't have to end this way," had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown louder, pressing against her thoughts like a question she couldn't ignore. The roads around her life had twisted so sharply in the past 2 years she barely recognized the map. A promising art career halted by sudden chronic illness. A fiancé who couldn't handle the shift and left. A friendship that turned bitter. And now here she was, back in the house where she had spent summers chasing fireflies. Only now she felt more like a ghost than the girl who once danced barefoot in the fields. She wasn't sure if she believed in miracles anymore. But she knew what disappointment tasted like, and it tasted like ash. Still, something inside her, faint and stubborn, held onto the whisper, not because she fully understood it, but because it had found her in the moment she felt most invisible. That mattered. So, She waited, listened, walked the gravel road she once ran barefoot, and with each step, a new question began to rise. What if this detour isn't the end of the journey, but the most important part of it? We live in a world that glorifies straight paths. We want life to move in a line, progression, promotion, achievement. Anything off course feels like failure. But God has always been a God of detours. The very geography of the Bible is filled with delayed arrivals and wandering paths. Joseph didn't ascend to leadership from a job application. He went through betrayal, imprisonment, and abandonment. David didn't move from shepherd to king overnight. He ran through caves with enemies chasing him. Even Jesus, Son of God, detoured through rejection, pain, and the cross before resurrection. The divine script rarely matches the one we write for ourselves. Lena's detour had begun with a diagnosis: lupus, an illness that no one expects at 28. She had built her life around fast movement, galleries, exhibitions, travel. Her art had been her voice, her joy, her prayer, but her body had turned on her, and when the pain took over, the invitations stopped, the attention faded. She went silent, and the world responded with silence back. But here's what she didn't realize at first. Silence isn't always abandonment. Sometimes it's the hush before healing begins. In the quiet of her unexpected return home, Lena discovered something she had forgotten. The roads of her childhood were still open. The porch swing still creaked. The pond still reflected stars. Her grandfather's workshop still smelled like pine and dust and dreams. These small, forgotten spaces began to speak louder than the crowd she once performed for. Detours do this. They strip away the noise, the striving, the obsession with outcome. They bring us back to who we are when the applause stops. And in that space, God begins to work on something deeper. Not the resume, not the social feed, but the soul. What Lena discovered, what many of us miss, is that detours aren't detours to God. They are design. They are alignment. A few weeks after returning, Lena stumbled across an old wooden box in the workshop. Inside were sketches, her grandfather's. He had been a carpenter, not an artist, but the sketches were careful and tender. Plans for tables, chairs, even a chapel he once dreamed of building with his own hands. She never knew he drew. She never asked. And somehow holding those drawings in her own artist's hands felt like finding treasure inside ruins. She began sketching again, not for galleries, not for approval, just because the paper listened when no one else did. One evening, as the sun melted behind the Appalachian hills, she sat in the field behind the house and asked, God, what now? No booming voice, no vision, just the wind brushing her cheek like a quiet nod. And then, ideas. A community art studio, a space for people like her, creatives who'd been sidelined by life, illness, or failure. A place not to impress, but to express. Not to showcase perfection, but to tell the truth through paint and pencil. Within weeks, she was drafting plans, sketching blueprints on butcher paper, applying for a local grant with trembling fingers. Every step was terrifying. Every click of the keyboard felt like defiance against the part of her that still believed she was done. But she wasn't. She was just now arriving at the place where the deeper work began. Detours do more than redirect your path. They rewrite your purpose. They teach you what you couldn't have learned on the straight road. They break your pride, sharpen your empathy, reveal strength you didn't know you carried. Lena's story may not have unfolded the way she'd imagined, but it had begun to bloom in a new way. The community space opened 6 months later inside an old feed store. Artists came, poets came, cancer survivors, retired teachers, grieving parents, kids from the neighborhood who had nowhere else to go after school. And Lena, no longer hiding behind galleries or scrolling past her own life, had never felt more whole. That whisper from the stormy night, it hadn't lied. It didn't end the way she thought it would. It ended better, but only because she let go of the story she'd written and allowed God to write one truer. And here is the part where it connects with your story. Maybe your detour hasn't yet turned. Maybe you're still sitting in the why or the what now. But what if this pause, this reroute, this delay is exactly where the new story begins? God is not just a God of restoration. He's a God of rerouting. He doesn't always put you back where you were. He often takes you somewhere better, somewhere deeper, somewhere more aligned with who you're becoming. But the question is, will you go? Will you let go of the need to explain everything and simply trust that the road you're on, even if it's winding through loss, confusion, or change, is still held in the palm of a Redeemer who sees the full map? He knows the roads unseen, and he's already prepared beauty on the other side. There's a sacred space in every story that no one ever asks to enter. It's not the beginning, full of fire and pain, and it's not the conclusion, wrapped in clarity and celebration. No, it's the middle, the messy, slow, often invisible place where nothing looks like it's changing, even though everything is. Lena found herself there not long after the studio opened. The first few weeks had been filled with momentum, calls, visits, applications, paint on her hands, and hope in her chest. But then, stillness. Days passed where no one showed up. The grant money moved slower than expected. Her own energy, always unpredictable, dipped again. Doubts slipped through the door like cold air. She stood in the middle of her own miracle and didn't feel miraculous at all. This is where many turn back, because the middle is where illusions fall away. It's where the thrill of a new beginning wears off and the grind of faith begins. The middle is where healing feels less like fireworks and more like watching paint dry. Quiet, unremarkable, but deeply necessary. One particular afternoon, Lena sat in the back corner of the studio, staring at a canvas she'd been trying to finish for weeks. It had started as a burst of emotion. Then it turned chaotic. Now it was just stuck, like her. A mess of overlapping brushstrokes and abandoned colors. Nothing about it made sense anymore. She considered tossing it, starting over. But something inside her, perhaps that whisper again, nudged her to stay, to wait, to look again, not for perfection, but for truth. So she did. She sat, she breathed, she stared, she listened. And slowly, something emerged. A pattern, a shape, a possibility she hadn't seen before. She picked up her brush, not with certainty, but with curiosity. And as she painted, something inside her shifted. That painting would go on to hang in the front window of the studio, titled Becoming. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. This is what healing looks like in the middle. Showing up when no one's clapping, believing when no one's watching, trying again when nothing seems to work. It's the slow resurrection that doesn't post well on Instagram, but transforms you from the inside out. The middle strips away applause. It reveals motive. It purifies intention. It asks questions like, are you doing this for results or for redemption? Are you pursuing healing or are you willing to be healed? Healing isn't just about what changes on the surface. It's about what deepens underneath. Lena began to see this in the lives around her too. There was Micah, the retired school counselor who wandered into the studio one rainy Thursday afternoon and never left. He didn't paint at first, just sat in the back, sipping tea, tracing lines in a sketchbook. When Lena finally asked what he was drawing, he simply said, "Memories." Later, she learned his wife had passed last fall. They used to visit art galleries together on their trips to Charleston. He hadn't walked into one since. But something about Lena's studio, imperfect, quiet, unpolished, felt safe enough to enter. Then there was Taylor, a 16-year-old who came every Wednesday after therapy. She barely spoke, just grabbed charcoal sticks and paper and worked in silence. Her lines were sharp, intense, sometimes angry, but every week she returned, as if the space gave her permission to feel something she hadn't known how to express. Neither of them was better. Not in the way people measure progress, but something sacred was happening. They were healing, not in lightning bolts, but in layers. Not with answers, but with presence. And Lena, she was healing too. Not because her illness vanished, or because everything was now perfect, but because she had stopped fighting the middle. She had stopped waiting for the after and had begun living fully in the now. There was a moment, one morning in late October, when she walked into the studio and found the sun pouring through the eastern window. Dust danced in the light. The air smelled of pine and paint and something holy. She stood there, just breathing it in. No one else was there. No grand event, no miracle announcement, but she wept. Because sometimes the clearest proof that healing is happening is when you find yourself feeling something again after being numb for so long. The miracle of the middle is this: you begin to love your life, not because it turned out the way you planned, but because it became something sacred in its surrender. This space between breakdown and breakthrough is where God builds resilience. It's where compassion takes root. It's where endurance grows legs. It's where your soul becomes sturdy enough to carry the next blessing without being crushed by it. Too often we wait for the next big thing to validate our faith. But what if the most important miracle is your daily showing up, your quiet courage, your unnoticed choosing of hope over hopelessness again and again? The world rewards fast success. Heaven honors faithful waiting. The middle may not be glamorous, but it's where your identity as a daughter or son of God solidifies. It's where your trust is forged, not in what God does, but in who He is. There's a quote Lena had once scribbled on a sticky note and forgotten. She found it again stuck to the bottom of a paint jar. Faith is not the absence of confusion. It's choosing to stay when walking away feels easier. That became her anthem, and maybe it can become yours too, because wherever you are right now, stuck, scared, uncertain, you are not abandoned. You are in the middle, and that means your story isn't over. God does some of His finest work in the spaces no one sees. And when it's time, when the ground has been softened and your soul has grown roots, the next door will open. The light will shift. The after will arrive, but not before the middle has done its holy work. Lena didn't build an empire. She built a sanctuary, and that sanctuary became the setting for stories she never expected, of grief being voiced, of hope being painted, of hearts healing in quiet defiance of despair. And her own heart? It didn't heal all at once, but it healed enough. Enough to keep going, enough to believe again, enough to look someone in the eye and say, "This isn't the end, you're in the middle," and that means something beautiful is on the way. The stories we tell ourselves are often the ones that wound us most deeply, and the ones we repeat silently, day after day, can eventually carve the very shape of our lives. For years, Lena had lived under a narrative that sounded something like, "You're only valuable when you're producing, when you're impressing, when you're on display." The world had confirmed this repeatedly. Magazine covers, gallery features, admiring critics, each one whispered, "This is who you are, this is what makes you matter." But when all of that collapsed, so did her self-perception. The illness, the breakup, the return home, all of it seemed like a loud verdict. You failed, you lost, you've reached your limit. Yet something had shifted over the months in Asheville. It began quietly, like most spiritual revolutions do, through the people who came through the studio, through the raw art on the walls, through the silence in the woods behind her grandfather's house, through the way the light hit her old bedroom floor at exactly 9:17 each morning. Small things, unrecorded things, but real. And in those spaces, a different voice began to rise. Not the critical one, not the inner perfectionist, not the voice of fear or past rejection. It was the voice that whispered in the car that night, the one she almost didn't believe was real. Only now it was saying something new. "You are not defined by what broke you. You are defined by what I've spoken over you." Lena didn't hear it audibly, but it came in waves. In words she journaled without fully understanding them, in unexpected tears during worship, in the subtle peace that began to replace the old anxiety. She realized she had been living under borrowed narratives for too long. Narratives from teachers who only praised outcomes, from friends who disappeared when she was no longer the fun one, from a culture that worshipped hustle and perfection. from her own inner critic that told her she had to earn every bit of love she received. But God had his own story, and it sounded nothing like theirs. It was the story of a daughter, not a performer, of someone who could be cherished while still healing, of someone who didn't need to be useful in the world's eyes to be powerful in God's. And slowly, Lena began to let that story become the louder one. The transformation wasn't immediate. Sometimes, it was a tug of war between the old script and the new voice. But every time she chose to believe God's version, every time she leaned into grace instead of guilt, something inside her healed more deeply. One morning, a woman named Karina walked into the studio. She was in her early 40s, dressed simply, eyes tired but kind. She introduced herself softly, explaining that she'd recently moved from Atlanta after leaving an abusive marriage. "I'm not an artist," she said, "but I think I need to put something on paper." Lena didn't ask questions. She simply handed her a brush, a canvas, and pointed to a quiet corner. Over the next hour, Karina painted swirls of dark blue and ash gray, sharp angles, thick strokes. Then, almost imperceptibly, the color softened. A line of gold appeared near the center. She didn't explain the painting. She didn't have to. Lena understood. When she finished, Karina whispered, "I didn't think I had a story worth telling, but maybe it's just still being written." Lena nodded, holding back tears. Exactly. The voice that rewrites narratives had spoken again, not through sermons or dramatic moments, but through paint, through courage, through a woman who dared to sit with her own pain long enough to let light seep in. Because this is how God works. He doesn't just rescue, he re-authors. He takes your story, the one others walked away from, the one you abandoned mid-sentence, and he picks up the pen, not to erase the past, but to redeem it, to write through it, to turn the ashes into ink. In the months that followed, Lena began leading a weekly gathering called New Words. People from all walks of life came together to rewrite old narratives. Some brought journals, others brought songs or collages, some just came to listen. But in every session, the same truth emerged. The voice of God speaks life into stories we thought were beyond repair. During one session, Lena asked each person to finish this sentence: "My story is not over because..." The answers were tender, raw, and unforgettable. "Because I woke up today with breath in my lungs. Because I'm learning how to forgive myself. Because my child still needs to see me try. Because healing can happen at any age. Because God is still speaking." And with every word spoken, shame lost a little more ground. Silence was replaced with strength. Identity, once fractured, began to form again, not based on success, but on truth. This is the miracle of the re-authored life. Not that you become someone else, but that you finally become who you were always meant to be. Lena began painting again, not for galleries, but for God. She painted prayers, she painted promises, she painted the journey of a woman no longer afraid of her own fragility, a woman who had let God rewrite the labels she used to wear like shackles. And in one of her final canvases of that year, she painted a tree, its branches gnarled and bent from storms, but its roots impossibly deep. At the base, she scrawled a single phrase, "Still growing." She didn't need a full sentence, just enough to say, "This story isn't over, and the voice that guides me isn't done speaking, and neither is yours." If you've spent your life under labels you didn't choose, if you've repeated false stories about your worth or your future, if you've believed the voice that says you are too broken to begin again, let this be your turning point. God's voice doesn't shout over your pain, it enters it. It doesn't deny your past, it transforms it. And when he writes, no one, no loss, no failure, no diagnosis can override the ending he has planned. Your new beginning doesn't start with a miracle. It starts with agreement. Agreeing with what God says about you instead of what shame says. Agreeing with your belovedness before your performance. agreeing that the pen has not been dropped. It's been passed to the one who knows the whole story. And now here's a question to reflect on and share with others. The morning sky over Asheville glowed with a fragile pink haze, the kind that makes you pause mid-step, mid-thought, and remember you're alive. Lena stood outside the studio with a mug of herbal tea, wrapped in her grandfather's old flannel jacket. Behind her, the space she once doubted would thrive was now humming with quiet movement. Easels upright, brushes soaking, laughter echoing from the back wall where someone had painted the words, "This space was made for becoming." In the soft hush of dawn, Lena whispered something she hadn't dared to speak aloud before. "Thank you for the instead." She didn't mean the detours alone or even the healing. She meant the exchange, the beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Isaiah had said it long ago, but now it wasn't just ancient poetry, it was her life. It was her anthem. God hadn't merely repaired the wreckage, He had transformed it. And that transformation didn't erase her past. It wove it into a larger purpose she could have never imagined. This was what the instead looked like. Instead of waiting for the world to validate her, she walked in quiet authority. Instead of fear paralyzing her, she moved forward, even if she trembled. Instead of pretending strength, she owned her tenderness and watched it become strength. Lena now understood something many never pause long enough to realize. God's instead rarely arrives with fireworks. It walks in on bare feet, through open doors you almost didn't notice. It shows up in conversations, in renewed courage, in ideas that come while chopping onions or folding laundry. It shows up when you stop demanding what you thought you lost and start receiving what God wants to give. That fall, the studio hosted an exhibition titled The Instead Collection. It wasn't a gallery in the traditional sense. There were no white walls, no critics, no champagne, just a community gathered in a circle, sharing the art of transformation. Each piece had a story behind it, a trade, a turning point. Micah shared his pencil sketch of a door slightly ajar. "Instead of bitterness, I chose memory," he said softly. "I stopped closing the door on the life I had and started opening it to the one still unfolding." Taylor, shy but radiant, displayed a vibrant, abstract painting. "Instead of silence, I spoke with color. This is how I said what I couldn't explain." Karina stood before a canvas of wildflowers breaking through stone. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Instead of hiding, I decided to bloom, even here, even now." And Lena? She unveiled the painting she'd started nearly a year ago, the one she had almost thrown away. Finished now, bold, layered, flawed, and beautiful. At the base, in delicate script, the middle held the miracle. Tears fell, laughter rose, stories collided. Something holy hovered in the air, not manufactured, not choreographed, just real. Just human hearts daring to believe in a God who doesn't abandon stories halfway through. That night, Lena walked back to the farmhouse under a sky shimmering with stars. The same gravel road she once limped down in confusion and grief now felt like a sacred path. The old voice still tried occasionally to whisper lies, but now she recognized it, and she knew better than to follow it. The new voice, the true voice, had trained her ear to recognize the sound of peace over panic, presence over pressure. Her story wasn't rare, it was just often unheard, because too many people stop walking before the instead arrives. Too many give up when the door closes, never realizing another one, quiet and powerful, is already swinging open behind them. Too many let fear write the final chapter when God's not even halfway through the plot. But not Lena, not anymore, and not you either. Because here's the truth. If you're still breathing, there is still a divine instead waiting to be revealed in your life. Instead of shame, acceptance. Instead of weariness, renewal. Instead of loss, legacy. Instead of running, rest. God's greatest gifts don't just patch you up, they reroute your entire direction. They introduce a version of you that's more whole, more honest, and more able to carry light for others. That's the hidden purpose of every delay and detour, to build within you a testimony strong enough to become shelter for someone else. Lena's studio wasn't just her healing, it was someone else's second chance. Your journey, however long, however winding, is meant for more than survival. It is being shaped to carry hope, to extend compassion, to radiate the unexplainable peace that only comes from walking closely with God through valleys and mountaintops alike. So when people ask where the shift happened, you'll point not to a single moment, but to the accumulation of ordinary, sacred steps. The moment you kept going, the day you cried but still opened the door, the afternoon you wrote something kind to yourself for the first time in months, the hour you said no to shame and yes to grace, the morning you looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. These are the breadcrumbs of becoming, and they lead to the place where the instead comes to life. Let them find you still walking. Let them find you with open hands. Let them find you expecting light, even in dim places. Because the God who whispered to Lena in a parked car on a rainy night is the same God whispering to you now. It doesn't have to end this way. There is more, there is new, there is beauty ahead. Hold your story loosely, but hold your hope tightly. He's not done, and neither are you. Which divine instead are you most hoping to walk into next? A, joy instead of exhaustion. B, purpose instead of confusion. Comment below with A or B, and maybe share a few words about what you're believing for. You never know who you might inspire with your story. If something in this story touched a place in you that words can't quite explain, don't let it stop here. Maybe you felt like Lena. Maybe you've been walking through your own middle, unsure if the next chapter will ever come. But I want you to hear this. You are not alone. Your story is still unfolding, and the instead you've been praying for might be closer than you think. If this message stirred your heart, if it made you cry, reflect, or simply breathe a little deeper, share it. Not for numbers, not for likes, but because someone else needs to know they're not forgotten in their own detour. Leave a comment. Write your version of "My story is not over," because let your words be a light for someone still sitting in the dark. And if you're willing, send this to one person who needs hope today. Just one. Together, let's be the reason someone else keeps going, because it doesn't have to end this way. And with God, it never does.